The Holy Gospel according to John, beginning at the 11th chapter. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jewish authorities were just now trying to stone you. And are you going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble because they see the light of this world. But those who walk in night stumble because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the Twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now, Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus, looking upward, and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. The Gospel of the Lord. Let's pause to take a few deep breaths together. It's been another tough week, hasn't it? We just completed our second week of our building closure at Holy Trinity, and it's been a week since Governor Cuomo issued his New York on pause order. With the numbers of cases skyrocketing here in New York and around the country, and reports changing seemingly every minute, it's a lot to take in. Sometimes it's too much. This morning, we find Mary and Martha, two of Jesus's longtime friends, in a moment that is just too much. Their brother is very ill, and so in desperation, they send for Jesus to come and heal him, knowing with every fiber of their being that Jesus could do what they ask of him. When Jesus receives their message, Lazarus' name isn't even given. He is simply told, "He whom you love is ill." And the gospel says that though Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus dearly, he waited 2 days before returning to Bethany in Judea. Jesus tarried, rather than going immediately to the aid of his friends, even says that he's glad that he did. But he does go, and promises that greater things will happen because he waited. In his travels, Jesus learns that Lazarus has died 4 days earlier, and that Lazarus' grieving family wants an explanation. Martha doesn't even wait for Jesus' arrival. She goes out to him, meeting him on the road, and in her anguish says, "Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus promises her that her brother will rise again, and Martha resolutely affirms her belief that one day that will be true. Jesus asks if she believes, and she says that she does. Then Jesus encounters Mary, the one who sat at his feet to listen to him teach, the one who anointed his feet with costly perfume and wiped it with her hair. Mary knelt at his feet like she had done so many times before and said to him, "Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died." And Mary cries. We can almost feel the flood of emotions coming out in her tears: anger, disappointment, confusion, sorrow, and many, many more. We hear the unasked questions too. Why did you take so long? Why didn't you help? Where were you? I can't help but wonder if we've been asking similar questions recently. Maybe you've been asking, why is this happening? Or where is God in all of this? I know that these questions have been in my mind. In suffering, there's a palpable feeling of separation, not just with one another, but even with God. Yet in all of their hurt, Jesus is moved in heart and in spirit. Jesus, the embodiment of God's own self, weeps, just like Mary and Martha do over the loss of his beloved friend. Jesus allows himself to be vulnerable and to emotionally express the love, compassion, and pain that he feels. Jesus expresses anger when he flips tables in the temple. He expresses frustration with the disciples when they do not understand the point that he is making. And Jesus weeps at the grave of his friend. It's so human. Jesus feels the same emotions that we do. Even as the crowd gathered, asked, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" While some questions don't have easy answers, the question of where God is present in the midst of suffering is readily apparent. God is right here in the midst of our vulnerability, big enough to take all the questions that we ask. In Jesus, God joins Mary and Martha in their suffering, and God joins us in ours too. God shows up in the tears. But the story doesn't end there. Jesus prays and gives thanks to God in the midst of the suffering of those gathered and shows everyone that he truly is the resurrection and the life, and cries out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And miraculously, Lazarus walks out of the tomb in the midst of his own deeply felt emotions. Jesus reverses illness and death. They do not get the final word, and neither will the coronavirus, beloveds, though the battle against it is far from over. Lazarus coming back to life does not erase the pain that those who loved him felt. It doesn't make his death any less real. It doesn't mean that Lazarus was never sick to begin with. What it does show us is that in the midst of all of that, there is still life. Jesus tells the people gathered to unbind Lazarus and to set him free. In the midst of disaster, not knowing what on earth happened, the first thing that Lazarus experiences upon walking out of the tomb is help. I can't help but think of a lesson I learned from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in that. Fred Rogers often told the story about when he was a boy and would see scary things on the news. He said, "My mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. To this day, especially in times of disaster, I remember my mother's words, and I am always comforted by realizing that there are still so many helpers, so many caring people in this world. I have been brought to tears repeatedly this week, reading and seeing the stories of the helpers. It's those stories that give me strength in the midst of all of the horror we are witnessing. In the midst of this outbreak and the precautions we are taking to prevent the spread, it's important to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves and one another. It's the reason why we will continue socially distancing even during Holy Week and Easter, as requested by Bishop Egensteiner and the Metropolitan New York Synod, even though we deeply wish we could be together. It's the reason we call, text, and live stream to check in on one another. We are still connected in this, and God is right here with us in the midst of every emotion and every question that we have. Growing up, one of the places I'd look for music to soothe my soul was in Broadway soundtracks. No matter what it was I was feeling in a given moment, there was a show tune for that. Whether I was at my highest high or my lowest low, Broadway never let me down, no matter what life threw my way. This week was no exception. You Will Be Found in the Broadway musical Dear Evan Hansen has some poignant wisdom to share with us. The song goes, even when the dark comes crashing through, when you need a friend to carry you, when you're broken on the ground, you will be found. Remember, beloveds, that God has found you in the midst of all that's going on in our world today. God has found you when what you're dealing with is just too much. God has found you when your brokenness, in your anger, your fear, your questions, your tears. And God will not let you go. You are not alone.